Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time zone you're joining us from. My name is Zsuzsanna Magdo, and I served as the Associate Director for the University of Pittsburgh's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the series Bodies in Focus, Power, Subjectivity, and Practice in East European and Eurasian Studies. This series will feature speakers from various disciplines and institutions, as well as practitioners from nonprofits in our region. The 6 panels we have planned will revolve around some broad, semi-provocative questions, some of which are, why is the body good to think with on both intellectual and professional matters? How do classed, diversely abled, gendered, and raced bodies interact in the daily lives we study, or the daily lives we inhabit through our avocations? What is the continuously evolving relationship between the body and the body politic, whether that's the nation, an empire, the EU, or NATO? Is research and teaching disembodying? And can recentering, quote unquote, embodied and uncomfortable knowledge therefore move liberation and East European and Eurasian studies forward? This last question is specifically to connect our conversations with the annual theme of the 2024 convention, hosted by the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and that theme is liberation this year. Part of a multi-year initiative supported by the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as 10+ regional studies centers in the United States. This year's series is organized by Petrice, the center I represent, in collaboration with the Ohio State University's Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Special thanks to my colleagues Alicia Baca and Emma Pratt at OSUCs, and Jennifer Tischler and Sarah Flesch at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's CRECA for their collegiality and collaboration. In addition to our colleagues from these centers, we also thank really great thanks to our scholarly consultants, Maria Galmarini, Pavel Levitsky, and Daria Cimbaluk, from whom you'll hear shortly. Last but not least, this series would not have been possible without the generous support of our association, ASSIS, as well as peer regional studies centers from the following institutions: the University of California, Berkeley, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Kansas, UNC Chapel Hill, University of Texas, also Harvard University, Indiana University Bloomington, and the George Washington University. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, a few housekeeping duties. We have 90 minutes allocated for this session, with audience Q&A reserved for the last 30 minutes. Audience members will have the opportunity to share questions, comments using Zoom's Q&A function, but we can also unmute audience members upon request to facilitate ADA access. If you desire to use this option, please use Zoom's raise hand function to ask to be unmuted. All panels in the series will be recorded and captioned automatically via Zoom during each session. You might need to turn your captioning button on in your Zoom window. Subsequently, recordings will be professionally captioned with end-to-end human review and made available early the week following each session on the program pages of the 3 organizing centers. If you have any questions about accessibility or wish to request accommodations for any future sessions, please contact csees@osu.edu. 2 weeks ahead, my colleague Alicia Baca will put the language and this email address in the chat momentarily. Now, let me introduce you to our guests for this panel. We thank Professor Vitaly Chernetsky for moderating this introductory panel for the series. Vitaly Chernetsky is president of the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies and professor of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas. A native of Odessa, Ukraine, Professor Chernetsky served as the director of the University of Kansas's Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies from 2015 to 2020. He's also a past president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, where he served from 2009 to 2018, and is the current first vice president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the United States. As an educator and researcher, Professor Chernetsky combines work on Ukrainian, Russian, and other Slavic literatures and cultures with a variety of cross-disciplinary engagements, most notably with film, gender and LGBTQ studies, Jewish studies, translation studies, and diaspora migration studies. He's the author of the award-winning book, Mapping Post-Communist Cultures, Russia and Ukraine in the Context of Globalization, which was published in 2007. He has also authored 5 edited and co-edited volumes, numerous articles and reviews, as well as published many translations from Ukrainian and Russian into English. He has a forthcoming book in Ukrainian titled Intersections and Breakthroughs, Ukrainian Literature and Cinema Between the Global and the Local. Let me now move to introducing our 3 scholarly consultants for this series who are also joining us as speakers today. Maria Galmarini is Associate Professor of History and Global Studies at William and Mary University. Her teaching interests include Russian and post-Soviet history, Stalinism, human rights, and cultural history of the Cold War. In her research, she specializes in Soviet and modern European history, with a particular focus on the history of disability and social rights. Her recent book, titled Ambassadors of Social Progress, A History of International Blind Activism in the Cold War, was published in 2024 by Northern Illinois University Press, so just this year. Congratulations. She is also the author of The Right to be Helped, Deviance, Entitlement, and the Soviet Moral Order, published in 2017 by the same press. Pavel Levitsky is currently an independent scholar, but he previously served as the Associate Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, before which he was lecturer and researcher at the Chair for Comparative Central European Studies at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt an der Oder. Dr. Levitsky's research interests cover embodiment of Europe and Europeanization from race-critical, gender, and post-colonial and post-imperial perspectives. Among his many publications, let me mention his ethnography, titled EU Space and the Euroclass, Modernity, Nationality, and Lifestyle Among Eurocrats in Brussels. This came out in 2018 from Columbia University Press. He also co-edited a special issue on European bodies, which appeared in the Anthropological Journal of European Cultures. Much of Dr. Levitsky's research also covered HIV-positive migrants, struggles for EU citizenship, and the emergence of gray zones in the EU. Our last speaker and consultant is Daria Tymbaluk, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature at the University of Chicago. Dr. Tymbaluk's research interests include environmental humanities, artistic research and critical creative practices, decolonial epistemologies, post-colonial studies, Russian imperialism, and of course, Ukrainian studies. Some of her most recent publications are the article titled Constellations of Ukrainian Thought and the Environmental Humanities, which was published in the Journal of Ukrainian Studies in 2023. There's also her article, I Dream of Seeing the Steppe Again, Planned Stories in the Context of Russia's War on Ukraine, which came out last year in Narrative Culture. and also what my body taught me about being a scholar of Ukraine and from Ukraine in times of Russia's war of aggression, an article that came out in the Journal of International Relations and Development also in 2023. Dr. Cymbaluk is currently working on her book manuscript, Ecocide in Ukraine, The Environmental Cost of Russia's War, which is set to be released in 2025. Thank you very much for everyone for being here. And with that, I invite our moderator, Professor Czernetsky, to start us off with this panel.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure and an honor to be joining you here today. And I'm really grateful to ASSIS and all the collaborating area studies centers who have been involved in this to continue year after year now, this really outstanding groups of panels. And what to me is very important, and I think this really brings for us a lasting impact, is the continuity in those panel series, because it really broadens the perspectives of our field and encourages us to make it indeed reach across the dividing walls, the silo effects that we may potentially have had, and despite our efforts to break through them, sometimes still find ourselves in. And I am delighted that in today's panel, we will have a chance to set up the conversation that we are going to have across the panel series of this academic year. And it will include both more general theoretic conversations and more specific case studies. It will include the shared perspectives of both established and emerging scholars. It also will engage matters of both research and pedagogy. So I think that we have a really outstanding opportunity to think and through and to arrive at some sort of new shared knowledge, some sort of epistemologic advancement in this area. What I think is very, very important as well is that we see this in a very concrete sense of how across the decades of recent history, if we don't even go further back into history, the embodied presence of the self is something that was influential and essential for the historic changes in our region. It was physical bodies of protesters that brought down the Soviet Empire, from protesters, the hunger strikers of the revolution on the granite in Ukraine, to protesters on the Manege Square in Moscow, to folks in the Václavské náměstí in Prague, or those who were breaking through the Berlin Wall. It is the bodies of those who became participants as both aggressors and victims in the many of the armed conflicts that broke out in the region, whether it was in the Western Balkans, in South Caucasus, and of course, in more recent tragic cases of the ongoing war of Russian aggression against Ukraine. This is also the bodies of demonstrators for gender equality, for LGBTQ rights, against racial discrimination, the bodies of indigenous activists who are trying to change both the political situation and our field that we are very much reminded of. It is the diversity of these bodies that we see, whether it's the protest events or solidarity events that are happening now, or indeed in the trenches of Ukraine's resistance against Russia's aggression. So, and these are bodies of many different kinds, bodies that are experiencing lasting consequences. So this also links with the questions of the bodies that are impacted physically, bodies that are traumatized, wounded, that are now transformed in their disability status and with very, very lasting consequences. In other words, we have a situation where the field is becoming much more intimately engaged with the problems of the corporeal simply because we have a far greater understanding now of how essential this is for our understanding of how knowledge is acquired, how knowledge is shared, and how knowledge is advanced in what we know about this region that we study, and indeed how we move forward in our goals of decolonization, of encouraging practices of epistemic justice and confronting past practices of epistemic injustice, and indeed seeking paths and practices and goals of advancing liberation in the region and in our academic discipline. With this, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Pavel Levitsky, to share his remarks. So we will see in the course of the panel that we will be shifting and pivoting across both the questions of more theoretical kind and questions that are more contextualized and specific. But as I hope all the audience members will see, they are all very deeply and meaningfully linked with each other. So let's continue with that. Pavel, you have the word.
Thank you, Vitaly. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zsuzsa, for inviting me. Thanks to my colleagues who are in this panel. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for this. My thanks goes to centers that are organizing this super interesting panel series. I will talk about refer to what Vitaly said about various liberation, or I will propose a set of questions based on my research. So my research was on how Europe is inscribed on bodies, but I will talk here about how bodies are culturally constructed and why body or embodiment is an interesting and fruitful research field and maybe an analytical concept. I will refer to postcolonial scholarship and scholarship on racism. I will talk about visual markers and about embodiment, a perspective on bodies and anthropology based on phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty. So my research was on European body, which is per se a problematic because it means essentialization of Europe and saying that there is a European body, which means that there is no non-European body. But what is it then, and what kind of essentializations we risk here? But this set of questions was imposed to me in my research field. As an anthropologist, I went to European Commission, to Brussels, to research how new member states, how people from new member states, bureaucrats who came there after the enlargement in 2004, how they were perceived, and how these other bodies arrived in Brussels that were not seen that were seen as a bit out of fashion, old-fashioned, funny-fashioned, or their fashion was incomprehensible. And this revealed that there was an unspoken rule in the Commission that this Europe that people at the Commission are daily forging has an embodied aspect, that Europeanization is embodied in a particular way. I pinned it down on what I called Eurostyle, a particular body performance, bodily hexes, movements, attire, and clothing, presence in particular places and in particular form. This Eurostyle is firm but variable, reflecting national specificities, but also the modernity of Europe, fashion and style of bourgeoisie, modest but not boring, specific and personal, but not loud and flashy, representing secularity and particular calm emotionality. Eastern European bodies were illegible or not readable, not fitting into the surrounding. Although they strived in many different ways, they were often marked as out of time, not fashionable, flashy, or trashy. I showed how proper embodiment in face of Eurostyle is a matter of achievement and labor, of emotions and affective distinctions. And I think Hirschkind wrote about secular body that is calm and that has calm and rational emotionality. So still, some bodies may pass as proper or marking or as belonging, and others don't. I think our work as scholars is to find out these rules of these cultural mechanisms that have powerful impact on our lives. I use Bourdieu's habitus concept that enables to show how size, shape, composure of a body is a marker of class and places people and their bodies socially. But what was particularly important in my research was critical race theory and postcolonial scholarship. Anne-Laura Stoller showed how in colonies, fear of the other, its alleged moral deficiency, but also its lacking hygiene and purity from which the white body needs to be protected, how this leads to a system of constant distinctions and racializations in order to retain power. Meaning, particularly classed and gendered and race bodies and intersections of race, class, and gender and sexuality will always remain privileged, although differently in different constellation and in different places and moments. Critical race theory and critical whiteness studies is insofar interesting that it grasps the way racism developed cultural mechanisms of visual markers that in turn enables us to evoke whole imaginations about what certain body represents, what kind of cultural stand, what belonging they have. Today, these visual markers enables us to navigate the social realm, but they also enable essentialization and hierarchization and place people on a social and cultural map, as we know, not always in a fair way. What I learned from critical race theory, apart from how this visuality is politicized and how we see bodies is very important and that it has history, is that whiteness and dignity of white and European body is dependent on any other body that is marked as non-white, not white enough or not European enough, and as not dignified. So what is interesting here, I think, is that these bodies constantly emerge in relations to each other and to the surrounding and situations. If they emerge in moments, and I take these emergencies of bodies from theory of embodiment, and means that they are constantly constructed and marked anew, that many different factors impact the ways we see bodies and mark them, race, class, gender, sexuality, and their intersections, but also space, time, and time. Some bodies are allowed to be in particular places and times, others don't, depending on how they emerge. And I think Daria Krzywonos later in this series is going to talk about how Eastern European bodies are taking particular spaces and places in Western European job market. Together with Annika Kainz in a special issue of Anthropological Journal of European Cultures, I have raised a set of questions on what this European body is. And as I mentioned, it is produced in marking of the other, in discourses about sexualities in Eastern Europe, allegedly less liberated and not progressive, in marking Muslim bodies that are threatening and uncivilized. All this, of course, in quotes. There are various discourses that come together to mark what is considered civilized, cultural, healthy, and normal to produce European body, producing implicit and tacit knowledge about embodied representation of Europe. This embodiment of Europe is happening also in certain spaces and time, but it also produces Europe, imaginations about it, and a silent cultural norm. There is research on how nationalism and state is inscribed on bodies and embodied. Also, in anthropology, there is research on cosmopolitan bodies or on secular bodies, as I mentioned. But putting together Europeanization and bodies, more specifically embodiment, shows ostensibly tribal cultural dynamics that activate racist, postcolonial, and imperial genealogies in embodiment. In the way bodies, as heterogeneous and unsecluded process and product of global entanglements, are living in the world and emerge in relations with their surrounding and in Europe, as well in distant spaces away from Europe. We show how colonial legacies is a past that enables us to read the present. We show how imperial genealogies enables to read today's embodiment of divisions and distinctions, cultural norms and non-norms. What bodies represent modernity, cosmopolitanism, progress, freedom, and emancipation. We also ask how production of European body is entrenched in capitalism and capitalist production. There is a Icelandic anthropologist discussing how Europe markets itself as a place to come on a global travel market by showing beautiful Icelandic almost naked woman immersing itself, of course white woman immersing itself in a hot spring. So imperial legacies become embodied in myriad ways and co-constitute Europe, and such focus enables to trace the empire in myriad of ways. It emerges in and through body. However, European body implies not unproblematic dualism. We have to be aware and think about what notions and histories enables us to pose the question of European body. What ideas and concepts has been there and conditioned the emergence of European body, or a question about European body. So it raises a set of questions. Is there a body not recognized as body because it's not perceived European? Or on the contrary, who is not allowed not to have a body? Who has the privilege of moving bodiless, hence invisibly? Is the body always human? Again, we don't think we can talk about existing graspable European body. The question is what powers and discourses and pasts makes this body possible to emerge, and what impacts Europe as a modern colonial project has on bodies and the way they are perceived and produced. And in this context, I think it is important to underline the Central and Eastern Europe has a particular role in emergence of this set of questions, as an adjacent and not always visible other, but always present, as a cultural space that enables emergence of constantly shifting borders of what Europe is. I think a perspective on body, and particularly moving body, Eastern European body, a body of a migrant, is very fruitful way to pose questions on Europe, Eastern Europe, his histories, genealogies, and cultural mechanisms that impact today's global dynamics. For example, on an emergence of global discourse on white supremacy. But that's already a different topic, so I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel, for your remarks. Indeed, a lot to think about. And also, I'm very glad that we are not only looking within the more narrow field of Central East European and Eurasian studies, but looking at the broader continental and global context as well, which I think is essential for us in this field. I'm pleased now for the colleagues in the audience, we will have our discussion towards the end. So I am now happy to give the floor to our next speaker, Professor Maria Cristina Galmarini. Cristina, you have the word.
Hello. Thank you so much, Vitaly, for your remarks, and Pavel also for your remarks. I will largely build on what you have said and add something from my own perspective. I also want to thank the centers at University of Pittsburgh, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Ohio State University for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on why bodies matter. As a historian, I share much of Pavel's assumptions and premises, scholarly premises about the body. I think of bodies and minds as well as contingent. This means that the entangled unit that scholars call the body-mind is inseparable from the powers that legislate its form, from the cultures in which the body-mind is produced. So to center the body-mind as a socio-historical object and also as a category of experience, to analyze it through metrics such as impairment, physical difference, illness, old age, or accident, is crucial to understanding the history of any given country, region, or system of beliefs. My research focuses on state socialism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So the question I ask myself when I think about bodies is, what do I really refer to when I think about the body-mind in a state socialist context? I also ask questions that are very much in line with those my colleagues already posed. I ask, what is the primary signifying framework in which the body-mind was embedded in that context? Was it Slavic culture, orthodoxy, Marxism? What was the body's main regulatory or normative agent, religion? A specific socialist regime of labor, political ideology, a combination of all of them. What arrays of appropriate psychophysical practices instructed individuals in Russia and Eastern Europe when it came to bodily practices, such as sex, rest, work, food, and many others. How did authorities legislate these practices, and how did people endorse or overrule these practices? Finally, and most crucially, in my opinion, what idealized forms of embodiment marked the socialist experience? How did so-called defective bodies and minds fell short of normative standards? Besides asking a question, setting the body as object of historical research also entails engaging with vast historiographies and intersecting historiographies with sophisticated social and biopolitical theories. It means thinking about change over time and variation across geography. So I'm trying to say that human bodies are very protein subjects, and we could have multiple panels discussing all possible ways of addressing the question of why bodies matter. Bodies have intrigued scholars in media and art, scholars of labor, of course, medicine, disability, gender, posthumanism, to mention just a few. So I'm interested especially in how we produce knowledge about the body. And on this, I'm building on Vitali's remarks, initial remarks. But to produce knowledge about the body, we need a positioning device and a framing device. Some scholars have looked at bodies through technology. Others have used violence, and especially colonial violence. Historians of 20th century Europe, Eastern Europe, especially in Russia, have tended to use ideology to frame their questions about bodies. So the choice of a framing device, and I want to tell a bit about my why this is on my mind as I started thinking about a new research project last summer. So this question of a framing device was on my mind last summer when I was researching the history of disability in Azerbaijan during the Soviet time. And this is a completely new geographic area for me. And while I've thought about disability a lot in the Soviet Union, I so far very much positioned myself in Russia. So I wanted to talk with people, with colleagues and people, and ask them, where do you think I should start from talking about positioning devices? So when I told people, including historians at the Azerbaijani Academy of Science, that I wanted to research the history of disability in Azerbaijan, I would always get a very perplexed look on people's faces. Disability, let alone the history of disability, was not a signifying framework or an epistemological unit for them. Disability could be a problem, a social issue, a medical issue, a consequence of war, a matter of charity, but not one of the ways in which the school system, the media, the cultural institution organize knowledge about the national past. As for my colleagues at the Academy of Science, they immediately understood that disability could be an object of historical research, but they also believed that disability is a quote, weightless object of inquiry, that is a subject that carries no significance and impact in the larger scheme of national history. Of course, this skepticism intrigued me even more than what I was already, and I decided to spend a month trying to figure out how Azerbaijani institution of knowledge tackled this epistemological conundrum. My assumption was that disability and disabled bodies could have not simply been erased from the country's history, and perhaps they were hidden. And the short answer is yes, the disabled bodies had not been erased, but were very well hidden. They also seemed ready to pop out of their hiding places the moment a researcher began to consciously look for them. And this is a process that disability scholars have called creeping the archive. And I will come back later to this idea of creeping the archive. But let me briefly tell you the story of my quest and what I learned about the rubrics by which a former Soviet republic, such as Azerbaijan, ordered unruly disabled bodies, how this society made them fit into its system of knowledge. So I focus on two institutions, the National Library of Azerbaijan and the State Archive, because my goal was to understand the very process of structuring knowledge about disability. I focus on the instruments by which knowledge is organized and made accessible. So if you allow me to use a metaphor related to the body, I wanted to see the skeleton of historical knowledge, the card catalogs in the library and finding aids in the archives. So at first glance, on a skin level, to use again that metaphor, disability was absent, of course. Yet when I went into some of the big epistemological categories by which these institutions organize knowledge, disabled people were everywhere. So in the drawer labeled education or the finding aid of the archival fund of the eponymous ministry, disabled bodies populated special schools, schools for deaf and blind children or for so-called mentally retarded people. Sick children being schooled at home were in this drawer as well. In the drawer medicine, disabled bodies lived in psychiatric wards and military hospitals. They interacted with orthopedic doctors, ophthalmologists, with reconstructive surgery specialists. They were the bodies of TBC patients, of war veterans, victims of accidents in oil and fishing industries, and there were many of those, given the economy of the country. In the drawer welfare, disabled bodies were the founders of workshops, cooperatives, and many other mutual aid associations. They were also the bodies examined by professionals who decided whether they deserved a pension or if these bodies were to be fitted with prosthetics of various types. So I could go on telling you about the surprising, perhaps, ways in which disabled bodies and disability, in fact, informed the larger realms of human knowledge and the institutions with bipolitical features that I looked at. But I think you got the point. So had I told my colleagues in Baku at the Academy of Science that I wanted to research the history of medicine, they would have easily pointed me to the container of that knowledge. But they didn't realize, and many of us don't think about that inside that container of knowledge, itself knowledge is created by disabled bodies and through juxtaposition between them and ideas of normality. Of course, the voices of disabled people are fragmented and randomly scattered in these containers. And this raises the question of who holds epistemological power. To use again the metaphor of the body, in the corpus of Soviet knowledge, disability has not enjoyed the status of a constituent member, yet it was the blood that flew through it. Western disability scholars have talked about this using the term creepistemologies. This is to emphasize the importance of knowledge produced by disabled people. And I suggest that in our region, we need to creep the edifice or the corpus of Soviet historical knowledge. And when we do that, we can make hidden what is, visible what is hidden. And this is important because epistemological frameworks inform epistemic ones. This is the meanings of disability, the meaning, what meaning we give to human bodies and disabled bodies in particular. Many of our colleagues have been doing this, precisely this type of work of creeping knowledge, creeping the archive. So we need to bring these contributions to the curriculum of how we teach Russian and Eastern European and Eurasian history in the school system at the university level. So I think as our region is going through an important time of rethinking the production of knowledge, how we have produced it, how we are producing now, and we are changing this process, decolonizing and queering knowledge. It's also very important to creep the production of knowledge and creep the archives, the way we look at them. And those are my ideas, building on what Vitaly mentioned, but also building on the larger geographies of Europe and how our region fits into the way bodies have been looked at so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Indeed, those are highly important and very deeply impactful questions. And scholars have been discovering on and on how the structuring of access, including in the archive of institutions in the countries in the region we study, have this very, very lasting impact, and how one needs to develop all these unusual strategies of subverting that restrictive structure to uncover indeed a wealth and richness of material that can be hidden in its various doors, to use the metaphor that you proposed. I now am glad to pass on the word to our third panelist, Daria Cymbaluk. Daria, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone, all the centers for the tremendous work of coordination, of coordinating this talk that really, the amount of effort, but the conversations we will be having and we already have been having and planning gives me a bit of hope and building, maybe even if very transit, but still a kind of epistemic community perhaps to think together with and yeah, to find each other, I think as well. When I was looking at the title of this first panel, Why Bodies Matter, I really appreciate the absence of a question mark in the end. In a way, I read it as affirmative, as a kind of saying this is why bodies matter, and I think that's why we are all here. But if we are to phrase it as a question, which is how often I think it is phrased in academic spaces, I wonder, what does it mean to ask why bodies matter? And perhaps whether it's just another way to say, to ask, why do I matter? Or at least that's why I read it when I see this question. And perhaps the kind of violence that is also part of that question of why do I matter? And why does my life, my existence, with all its pain and joy and contradictions and confusion, matter to academia and to knowledge? And do they really matter? Indeed, do they matter? And in which way do they matter? Does my life matter as a primary source that perhaps will be studied at some point by a scholar with a more objective distance, whether now or sometime in the future? Does my life matter as some kind of unfortunate statistics? I constantly wonder and question what is my place really in academia? And also it is all kind of tremendously sad in a way to be asking these questions, and even to keep discussing these questions after so much amazing scholarship that has been done and written, and in a way of kind of constantly reaffirming that that bodies matter in this. They appreciate all our efforts, but in a way it's also, there's a kind of sadness to me in this, that we have to reaffirm as if it's going to be forgotten and we can move on without disembodied realities. And of course, in this processes of mattering, which are always linked, they're always linked to life and death, to those categorized worthy to live or die, as my colleagues were also mentioning, which are also, of course, processes of dehumanization, such as for those whose bodies have been violently racialized, or those living and working from deadly realities, such as the war realities, but not only. And to me, I guess, to answer this question, why bodies matter, is to say that because we matter, persons matter to me, people matter to me. And that goes back to the question of knowledge, for me, being always embodied. Even though we are constantly tricked, and through our academic training and through, I'm an early career scholar recently out of PhD program, just a couple of years, and through your training, you kind of constantly tricked into believing the knowledge is disembodied. And as Pavel asked, who's allowed to have invisible bodies, right? But there's this idea that objectivity, the notion of objectivity is somehow closer to reality, which I would like to contest. And of course, there's so much written on this, and yet we are still here. And in my work, the body is not a direct focus. So in the forthcoming book, I have a chapter on bodies, human and non-human. But in a way, I cannot ignore my body. It structures my work fundamentally. So it's not a subject in that way, but kind of a place that I think from and I think with, and that really conditions the way I understand knowledge. As embodied, and knowledge is existential, but knowledge is also being about life and death. And perhaps that also has to do something in a kind of a situation of almost ontological sadness, sometimes I think, but the way we are conditioned, in a way, certain bodies conditioned to think about these questions, is that I submitted my PhD in December 2021, so just 2 months before the full-scale invasion. And my PhD was about stories from the east of Ukraine. So for years, even though I don't come from the east of Ukraine, so my family was largely unaffected by Russia's war in Ukraine, minus my dad served in the army, but we lived in safety and far away from the places of war. But I actively kind of listened and attuned myself to experiences of the war and displacement in my practice, both as a scholar, but also in my artistic practice. So, it was there, but of course, 2022 changed a lot. But the interesting moment as well, that when you submit a PhD in the UK, and I was in Scotland, the day you submit a final copy, your visa gets automatically cancelled. So the registry reports to the Home Office, and this is the termination of your visa. Student visa, and then I had to apply for a new visa, so I got stranded in the UK and I couldn't go to Ukraine, and in that last kind of winter break, I didn't see Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. And when the full-scale invasion started, I was precariously employed on 5 zero-hour contracts, teaching 8 groups of students across 5 different subjects, as wide as foreign policy to drama to translation. And it really became clear to me the kind of disparity between experiences of my body, the exhaustion, which of course can be compared to the experiences of those on the ground in Ukraine, but all that emotional exhaustion, but also physical and sleep deprivation that I was feeling, and the institution I was working for. And I was really pulled through in those first months only by colleagues, so by other bodies, by individuals, by institutions, was completely incapable. Not only incapable, but it really made me think of the disparity between studying the war and being, part of the experience in a war, a distant, privileged experience of the war, and how the universities, and it relates, I've always known it, and people know it, but the institutions constantly kind of push out the uncomfortable bodies, whether they're bodies of migrants, bodies of those affected by the war, in differently racialized bodies, disabled bodies. So you constantly an obstacle and a problem to get rid of, and that's exactly how I felt. And that's when I wrote a short piece entitled "Academia Must Recenter Embodied and Uncomfortable Knowledge," kind of trying to reclaim that space of knowledge. And then as the full-scale invasion continued, I continued thinking and being also struggling, and to this day very much pulled between kind of different tension, the tension of the urgency of here and now, the exhaustion of it, the need to do something to address the belief in wanting to do something just and intervene, and that kind of urgent temporality and the timeless eternal temporality of academia, which just operates on such different scale and priorities. And you constantly kind of have to balance between those, which I think I do very unsuccessfully, which obviously just you're kind of in a constant this overheated state of exhaustion and failing, I think, at all fronts. But also it really makes me think, what is the place and how does academia actively gets rid of the critical scholarship, right? Because of the bodies that usually tend to perform it quite often, but also the different temporalities embedded in the critical urgent scholarship when the world is on fire, I mean, in all directions at this moment. And what is the role of knowledge then is something that I really think, but also thinking with my body, and something I've been learning in this past years, that my body knows quite often before my mind. It is from those experiences of feeling uncomfortable, of feeling threatened at times, feeling kind of incapacitated to do anything, kind of silenced, that I started to recognize patterns of violence. So my brain catches later, and the analytical kind of perspective catches later with that. And I start to recognize the alienation that is built into my trajectory as well as a scholar from a particular place and time. And that is something I thought about in the text that was mentioned, what my body taught me about being a scholar of Ukraine and from Ukraine in terms of Russia's war of aggression. And I thought there a lot with bell hooks, and it's this text, the text of others who've written, and hearing my colleagues today really provide some kind of solace above everything, of recognition of this experiences. But there is a text by bell hooks called Essentialism and Experience, in which she theorizes, quote, a particular knowledge that comes from suffering, or another quote, the passion of experience, the passion of remembrance. And it really kind of gave me a starting point to think of knowledge as dwelling in my body that suffers, and ways to build on it and to kind of take it seriously and listen to it. And it also kind of gave me a little bit of more confidence, therefore, in staying with the kind of messy, discoordinated work full of failures, and exhaustion and kind of sleepless nights that I'm doing, and that doesn't fit into the very often one direction tracks, neat categories of academia, with which I struggle very much. And you know, returning to the point that knowledge is existential, and it's existential, and you know, thinking once again of whether, like, what knowledge brings us closer to reality. And I think it's existential in that way that it's not separated from the messiness and suffering of life, and it's, you know, that's exactly where it comes from, and how thinking with that space structures the kind of work you do, the kind of forms your work takes, whether it's, I don't know, a participatory workshop, or is it a peer review article which will appear when perhaps the place that you're writing will not exist, you know, writing about will not exist anymore, and the urgencies deeply embedded in the kind of work that I've been doing. And the tension of kind of following the streams provided by the academia with all its plans and expectations and career goals and scheduled projects, and this one direction track that is ascribed, which I really felt as a, you know, PhD, post-PhD, the direction I'm supposed to be moving, and the difficulty of actually figuring out what is that I believe really matters at this moment of time, and the kind of like deep honesty with oneself and with addressing what is, how do I, what do I do in this moment of the world being on fire, and in relation to one's kind of visceral life. And in thinking of knowledge is being a matter of life or death, and reaching that honesty with oneself and acting and kind of disengaging quite often from that stream that is expected and that is also violent and has shaped your thinking more deeply than I perhaps fully realize. And I'll stop here and can maybe pick it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daria, and thank you so much once again to all the panelists. Indeed, we've had a series of remarks that are deeply emotionally engaging and intellectually engaging. And I think this is an important part for us. We have, in approaching the problem of and the phenomenon of bodily existence in this very messy world on fire, as Daria has just said, we need to be critically attuned also to what our own bodies teach us, what the bodies of those near and dear to us do, what the bodies of others who we encounter, who may be people who we are not used to encounter, and whom in the new situations those encounters can teach and transform us as well. So we have had, I think, indeed a very important sort of balance in our panel between setting up the big questions that I can relate to very much myself, being temporarily based in Europe as well. I am on a research fellowship at the University of Basel in Switzerland at the moment, and actually being sort of moving from the US to Europe temporarily and experiencing the consequences of various processes of migration, past and present, including obviously the mass migration from Ukraine, my country of birth, and in Europe, you see so many more displaced Ukrainians, obviously, than in the United States. And even my experience earlier this week, going to Vienna to give a guest lecture, I stayed at a hotel where which has been a social venture employing refugees. So most of the employees there are either Middle Eastern by background or Ukrainian by background. But Ukrainians are only women. So they were usually, say, the front desk was staffed by a Syrian man and a Ukrainian woman at that hotel. And this also emphasizes that in the history of bodily experiences, certain bodies were given access or privilege of being able to cross certain borders or to acquire certain kind of privileges, and others were actively denied. Some bodies are seen as bodies that are more essential or less essential for national projects of nation building or the defense of the nation in times of peril. We also see, again, questions of inclusion and exclusion that are becoming hugely pertinent. Again, the situation in Ukraine, given the fundamental, deepest possible transformations that are very traumatic, that are resulting from the full-scale invasion, have created stresses that, on the one hand, we see tensions of, direction of unity. We also see disunity. We see amazing resilience, but then we see the fetishization of that resilience and actually see people actually under a lot of stress, both physical and mental and psychological, and the damage that that stress does. So in other words, we see how this topic moves across disciplines, and it also creates different kinds of shared resonances that cut across the disciplinary divide. Just as today we had a presentation by a historian, an anthropologist, and Daria, you hope that is a literature and culture, but I know that you're very much an interdisciplinary scholar whose profile cuts much broader across these things. But we come here at a meeting point where these many issues are all linked with each other. So as our members of the audience are getting ready to ask their question, I also, of course, will invite you to ask questions to each other. But my first question to all three of you would be about moving past and beyond the disciplinary divides. I mean, in our group, we have a wonderful diversity of backgrounds, intellectually, culturally, institutionally, and otherwise. My question would be, in this dialogue, what do you hope to achieve by engaging with colleagues from outside your immediate disciplinary environment? In other words, what can a historian, you hope, would be able to learn from an anthropologist or from an environmental humanities specialist, et cetera, et cetera? So this is my question. How do we, what sort of synergies and new energy in a cross-disciplinary encounter we hope to find here? And it's an open question to everyone.
It's not an easy one.
Not an easy one, but Christine, I see you smiling. Maybe you would like to go first?
I can go first. Of course, interdisciplinarity, I mean, it goes back to the point I made at the beginning of my intervention about the protein character of the body-mind unit as an object of scholarly analysis. It does require, right, if we think about bodies, this absolutely requires interdisciplinary approaches. In the humanities and social sciences, right? So in future panels, we will have activists, for instance, speaking about the body. We will have people who work with media and art. And it's fundamental that we bring together these perspectives, because otherwise we keep doing the work of hiding and making invisible some questions and facets of why bodies matter. So in interventions today, there was a lot of overlap. But for instance, in my research, just to think about markers of identity, I don't engage much with race, and regrettably so, right? So listening to Pavel, I was able to think more about whiteness and how it applies in intersectional ways with my questions about disability. While listening to Daria's contribution and intervention, I was thinking about something that I didn't talk about in my speech, which is the very physical accessibility of the institutions of knowledge, right? So my body could go through the stairs and the steps and the elevators because I walk on two legs, right? But walking through Baku, for instance, I realized how my my visual impairments and the fact that I don't see well at night hindered my mobility at night a lot. And I, for anybody who has been in Baku, the streets are not very practicable for both people on wheelchairs and those who don't see well. So listening to how we as scholars have embodied experiences and how that affects the production of knowledge is fundamental. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think there is no other way to think about bodies than through interdisciplinary conversations.
Thank you. No, this is very much to the point. Thank you. Okay, who wants to go next?
Shall I go, Pavel?
Sure, you can go next, sure.
I don't know, it's hard, and I perhaps will answer controversially. I mean, I'm an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary scholar. Sometimes I feel like actually somebody who just like transgresses disciplines constantly, perhaps without realizing. I struggle with disciplines, and this is a controversial perhaps statement, and fully grasping disciplines. I understand that they develop that important genealogies of knowledge and conversations that developed and methodologies that developed within certain disciplines, but I struggle with some kind of the way they can also be exclusive and seen as almost kind of delineating boundaries that are not to be crossed. And it, of course, once you go into academia as profession with all the peer review structure departments, it's more and more prominent, right? And in that way, I also think, I mean, there's value to it and value to these histories and practices, absolutely. But I also think it's important to think of them perhaps also certain sites of power. I think it comes more into focus when you start engaging with people who are in a kind of para-academic realm, right? Who are a little bit outside, and for them it's even more confusing what's going on and how can you engage. Because there are different ways of conceptualizing knowledge, I guess, when you're deeply inside academia and slightly on the edges of it. And therefore, yeah, I'm very much, my work is, I follow ideas rather than disciplines, which is also looked down upon, I think, a lot. And I struggle with, but for me, it's also about another kind of access. And another kind of way of including different forms of knowledges, which might not be recognized as such. And on that matter as well, I guess working, and there was a question as well that kind of links to this in the chat, but working in a certain context, and I feel like the context or themes that I work with, it's almost by necessity that you need to engage with different disciplines and different forms of knowledge. I mean, when you're writing about different modern human experiences, there's just as much you can't, there's, or in specific context, let's say the south of Ukraine, I mean, there's a very limited amount of novels, even if one that you can find, so you really have to be kind of creative and speculative and a little bit, like I think of it as like salvaging pieces. That's what you do in a work, and it's working in a very particular, unstable and shattered environment as well, which is not the same as perhaps if I was, I don't know, a scholar of 19th century English literature. I mean, I assume maybe there's more stuff to, to work with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's not an easy answer. Of course, a lot has been said already, and I would underline what Maria said. I mean, body, you intrinsically look at it from very different perspectives, and yeah, it's something that really invites you to use many different perspectives. But also, I have honestly some similar stadia, not good experiences with interdisciplinary. I remember like 10 years ago, everyone was interdisciplinary, and I organized a workshop on EU legitimacy or legitimation, and it was supposed to be interdisciplinary, but actually everyone sticked so vehemently to their perspective, and to there was not even a conversation on. And I don't know, if I mean, if we talk about racism, we can pose certain questions, use perspectives like on racism on Crip or Crip perspective, but does that make me automatically interdisciplinary, or, you know, using a different set of questions from a different discipline? So I think it's, you know, there's a lot of talking about it, but I don't think we really do it on one hand. And I would probably say that, you know, body is something that invites us to do it. And certainly I would differentiate between disciplines, however you want, you know, it's already difficult to delineate these disciplines, and perspectives, or, you know, theoretical concepts that are, you know, informing our perspectives on things that we study.
Wonderful. And this is actually, I think, a perfect segue to move into the questions. We already have several questions in the Q&A of the webinar. So the first the question was from Natalia Volvach, and she writes, "Thank you for these excellent and deeply thought through talks. I have several questions. Question for Pavel. How do you feel that Bourdieusian theorization of the body in terms of hexes is helpful for the analysis of the experiencing body? Would you please tell us more about your point regarding moving East European bodies and shifting borders? These matters about the body resonate with my research as well." And also from Natalia, a question for Daria. Would you please speak to the intersection of art, your scholarly practice, and your body? How do you merge these and bring art into the research and research dissemination projects that you pursue? Thank you.
Should I start?
Yeah, Pavel, yes, please go ahead.
Natalia, thank you so much for this question. It's really beautiful and not also easy. I guess Bourdieu was often criticized already, you know, for being blind to racism. And I used him, you know, in my book, I'm using actually only him. It's only my later research that I use race theory, critical race theory, or, you know, race scholarship on racism, because this is critical race theory, and, you know, a theory on global racism gave me a gate and a way to discuss and focus and have a critical perspective on Europe, and more, you know, global entanglements between Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, you know, maybe Europe and Africa, and stuff like that. And since, you know, we're all affected by racism, it was very fruitful way and avenue, you know, to discuss the things that I observed in the commission. Racialization, essentializations, actually, essentializations and hierarchizations of bodies. And regarding moving Eastern European bodies and shifting borders, so you know, that's why I love this topic of body, because I think with the body, whole imaginations travel. Probably, you know, people who are marked as exactly disabled, Eastern European, Black or whatever, they that's what I said in my talk, you know, there are spaces when they are allowed and, you know, in their place, but there are also spaces when they are not on their place. And that's exactly where the border is produced, or, you know, where this whole dynamics of creating border markings is becoming relevant and is becoming visible. So this is what I mean. And then shifting borders, I guess, you know, that's what I refer to in the Europeanization process. You know, Poland has been you know, Eastern European country, and still is in many, you know, different ways. But the border visibly, in many ways, also shifted. Right? It's not the eastern border of Germany right now, but it's the eastern border of Poland right now. A very hard border and very, you know, super racialized border right now. And that, you know, that means that, you know, the notion of Europeanness, that these bodies who are European, more European or less European, has been shifted. But, you know, this is also another way of conceptualizing borders in context of bodies, because I would rather see this body as, crisscrossed by different borders that, I was talking about, that emerged all the time and that are produced in certain moments.
Okay. Daria, would you like to contribute, please?
I'm just gonna thank you for the question. Just very quickly, I think in terms of artistic practices, just try to break them into three streams. The first one is perhaps urgency and immediacy that is not available because of the different temporalities in which academia operates. And you can make, I don't know, a drawing workshop, and it will be you can engage differently and more urgently. I think that is important to me at this moment. Different audiences. Talking to people outside academia has always been very central, also because my PhD work was on people who were displaced by the war, and it always it felt a bit odd that I would just interview people and then write a PhD that they would never read and put it in my drawer. But I always think of like how to return it, and in that sense, peer review article is not the best way to share sometimes with people who are outside academia. And lastly is that becomes more and more important to me is the notion of associative logic of artistic practice, which is developed by Lucy Cotter in her work, but in a way that there are lots of experiences that I can't necessarily put into an academic argument at this point in time. Perhaps I will, but nevertheless, I find them important and urgent. And the kind of idea of associative logic provides room for articulation rather than argumentation, but allows you to address something very important that you might not be able to analytically perhaps tackle. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. We have only about 10 minutes left, and so we have some more questions in the Q&A. All the commenters are really grateful to all the speakers. One question, which is from Volga Verbelovich, applies to all three colleagues. What is the resource or tool, reflective or practical device that helps you listen to your body and learn from it? Again, this is a question to all three, whoever wants to answer.
For me, I'm sorry, I just go ahead, sorry. It's a rather, question from psychology or about psychology, but well, I would just refer to my book and the introduction to it, where the body is the whole source of epistemology, and how we exactly perceive particular moments. We read bodies, other people's bodies, we read our own bodies. And I guess, we just have to be self-reflexive and culturally sensitive. I guess, that's the magic or black box of ethnography. Either you have it or you learn it, or you know how to do it or you don't. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer to that. Sorry.
Anyone else?
Unless Christina wants to say, I'll just say that I think I'm constantly failing at it. In fact, I think that the way the world, and particularly academia, is structured, that it constantly requires you to be a disembodied presence, including the way conferences are even structured, right? I mean, I don't know. There's like no breaks. I mean, it's just the whole structure of it. And I feel like I struggle. So my way is like trying to actively disengage with it, but I just constantly fail at it. I feel like I constantly perform this just in the amount of, the work I do. So I'm not really good at it, but I would like to be better.
I can definitely second what Daria said. I think I'm very good at abusing my body and disembodying myself and like maybe the way my training has been, or the ways we have been brought up. I don't know. This is a question, as Pavel said, for psychologists, but I tend to see myself as a huge brain more than. So I'm not the right person to ask that question at all.
But I would actually only add that, I think it's a good question because it points really to the black spot of epistemology, that it's not legitimate to talk about, knowledge that comes from body and, particularly your own body as a researcher, because it's, you know, too singular, too, yeah, subjective.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if I may add, it's also about our affinities, right? And our bodies and our minds create affinities between us and our subjects sometimes, or the objects of our research. So this is about the perspective. And when I was talking about positioning device, where do I look at disability from? I have to acknowledge that I come with my not only politics and my past, but also with this particular gendered and able-bodied persona. So absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, we have 2 more questions. One question is primarily to Christina, and that's from Rachel Schroeder. Are there specific limits or problematic aspects of Western epistemology of cripping, as in cripping the archive, especially around embodiment, that you've encountered in applying the framework in your work in Eastern Europe and Eurasia? The colleague is only starting to, research in this area and would be grateful for the insight. So in other words, this is something that we've had, this issue of traveling theories that Edward Said talked about 40 years ago. If this, you know, queer theory and crip theory and other sort of theoretical toolkits that have been developed were primarily developed on material of the West, or the West and the global South, and really the engagement with Eastern Europe and Eurasia in many cases has been too limited. And how do we break through that? And so, yes, how do you approach this in your work?
Well, it's a very difficult question, a very important one. I don't have any like practical advice, but I think one of the biggest limitations when historians of 20th century Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union try to crypt the archive is precisely the issue of epistemological power, which is finding the voices, right? So even in the examples that I gave, a lot of the sources you deal with are filtered and mediated by bureaucrats, doctors, experts. And this is, I think, something peculiar to the state socialist context, in which it was very difficult for, until the 1980s, right, with the restructuring of the 1980s, it's very difficult to find in the institutionalized, in the institutions of knowledge, the official one, the libraries, the archives, it's very difficult to crypt them in the Western sense of finding the voices of people with disabilities themselves. It is not impossible, of course, but it's difficult. So I think that when we as historians of 20th century Eastern Europe and Russia crypt the archive, we need to do something more than just then looking for the voices. That's important, absolutely important. But it's also about approaching the very institutions that build knowledge differently and trying to deconstruct the ways in which knowledge has been compartmentalized. And this is perhaps a difference, a theoretical difference, I would say, between crypting the archive in more in the global north and in liberal context, liberal democratic context for the 20th century, than in state socialism. So that's a big difference, I think.
Thank you so much. A question from Kristina Polyakova for Pavel. Could you elaborate on the opposition between bodiless and bodyful, concerning those, as you have said, that do not have the right not to have a body based on the hierarchy between Europeans and non-Europeans? Could you also apply to, could this also apply to hierarchies built on other, often intersectional criteria?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, you know, there are situations where some people are not allowed not to have body. And I refer here mostly, to racialized, like slaves, or, people who are placed in a particular place because of their supposedly, cultural traits, doing particular kinds of work. They, as opposed to those, like, white people, who, as critical whiteness theory shows, are, invisible all the time because their body is just, natural, and this is, the norm. They don't need to have a body. They can allow themselves, have the privileged, not their body to be, particularly seen. But this, depends on the context. This depends on the situation. Sometimes, this white privileged person will have a very much body once, it finds itself in a more racialized or disprivileged context. So, and in that sense, that's intersectional and, emerging. The bodiless or bodyful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. And then Daria, you said we only have a couple of minutes left. You're going to answer a question from Monica Eppinger. Please go ahead.
I wanted to type there. I messed up. I wanted to type, but I just want to type. It's a great question that Monica raised in terms of body-mind division. I don't know how to bring it back. I wish people read it. Sorry.
Okay, so let me read it. So question, if we have time, do you experience the mind learning from the body learning from the mind, or is this a false distinction in a body-mind framing? And the earlier part, how does reasoning from the body work with trying to understand collective experience? Is the body particularly individualized? And this would be our last question, after which I'll have to give the floor back to Zsuzsa for closing remarks on the logistical things.
I just want to say it's such a great question, this distinctions that we keep reproducing, I think, right? Even as we speak. Yeah, no, I just love the question. And perhaps what happens is, and it goes back to this kind of constant need to perform disembodiment, even if you fail at it constantly anyway, because your body doesn't fit. But I feel like it's almost like this inherent patterns that you perform. And it's not that the mind comes after or that the body is separate, but the mind kind of has a regulating function. I don't know, is it? I don't know, maybe I'm not gonna go there, but I feel like I feel like I'm constantly fighting against the expectations and figuring out what is actually the ways in which I want to do my work. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you. I will, before I give the floor back to Zsuzsa, I just want to thank all the panelists. And even though we didn't have a chance to answer the question from Yulia Chernyshova, I want to acknowledge Yulia's wonderful question and comment. And the demand for all of us to deal with a sense of urgency in the topics that we address, and also how we find hope in the work that we do in, as been said so many times today, the world feels like it is on fire, and indeed is in a very critical way. This is something that we all struggle with, and we do not have a ready answer to, but this is, I think, thinking about that and trying to act on that is something that informs our daily practice. And so thank you again so much for getting the ball rolling for our panel series in such a powerful way, of the banner of critical epistemology, looking through and thinking through and producing knowledge through the body is going to be something that a lot of colleagues, I'm sure, will look for and will find wonderful insights in. So thank you, panelists, to be continued. And I now give the floor to Zsuzsa for some closing logistical remarks.
Thank you very much. We are 1 minute past our time. So let me just briefly say that on behalf of all the organizing centers, the association, and all co-sponsoring institutions, we are very grateful to you, Vitaly, Christina, Pavel, Daria, as well as the audience members for crafting such a substantive conversation to start off this series. And perhaps the kind of epistemic community that Daria mentioned, which may be temporary, it will likely be, but hopefully you'll find it no less meaningful. We are really grateful. Before we close, I want to remind everyone that we have another panel coming up next Friday at the same time, so 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, on new directions of research, which will be moderated by Christina, with speakers from the University of Vienna, Katarina Widlak, and the Ohio State University, Gala Kornienko. If you haven't registered yet, please do so. As I mentioned at the beginning, all panels in this series will be recorded. Subsequently, we will improve the captioning and release the videos a few days after each session. If you have any questions about accessibility or wish to request accommodations for any future sessions, please make sure to write to OSU at the email address I pasted in the chat. Hopefully everybody can see it. If they need 2 weeks notice, essentially, to accommodate you. Thank you again, and have a nice weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you.